Hi friends, and thanks so much for picking up the Flatiron Shawl pattern. In this quick tutorial, I'll be going through some highlights from the pattern and also the first few rows with you. Before we jump into the crocheting, I wanted to talk about some of the notable parts of the pattern. First off, let's talk about the yarn. I use a very specific yarn for this pattern, but you can swap it out for any 3 100-gram skeins of fingering weight yarn. And then you want an additional 30 yards or 1 mini skein of fingering weight for the border. The border is optional, and I've seen some really gorgeous Flatiron shawls that don't even have borders, so you can have fun with that however you like. To achieve the drape of this pattern, I went with a 5mm hook. A 5mm hook is much larger than what is typically recommended for fingering weight yarn, and that allows the project to have a lot of drape and a lot of really good dimension. Now my pattern uses fingering weight yarn, but you can use whatever weight yarn that you like. I think to still achieve the look of the Flatiron shawl, I wouldn't go any heavier than a worsted weight yarn. So I did want to make some suggestions when it comes to adjusting your hook if you change your yarn. So if you decide to use a sport weight yarn, which is a category 2 weight yarn, I would suggest a 5.5mm or a 6mm hook. For DK weight yarn or a category 3 yarn, I would suggest a 6mm hook or a 6.5mm hook. And then for worsted weight, I would suggest a 6.5mm hook or a 7mm hook. Now let's move on through the pattern and talk about gauge. I wrote out the gauge for the yarn that I used, but understand that gauge is not super important in a pattern like this. Since the pattern is basically freeform and the entire pattern is based on the length of your sections, gauge is not going to make a huge difference, so don't get too caught up on this. Next up, let's talk about some of the abbreviations. Specifically, I wanted to talk about this one, INC, which means increase. In this pattern, increase means to place 2 single crochets in the same stitch to make an increase. Next up, let's look at the pattern notes and go through them individually. First off, understand that the chain 1 at the beginning of a row does not count as a stitch. Just pretend it's not even there, and you will not count it when you count your stitches in your row if you decide to do that. Also, this pattern is written in crochet shorthand, and this helps to write the pattern so there's not a lot of additional wording and that it doesn't get confusing as you read it. So instead of writing single crochet in the next stitch, I just write SC1, which means to place 1 single crochet in the next stitch. If you see SC2, that means to single crochet in each of the next 2 stitches. The next point says that this pattern is written more as a recipe than a row by row pattern. You'll want to keep your tape measure handy to adjust your shawl based on the yarn that you use. And in the pattern, I show how to measure your sections to make sure that you have the right size shawl. And then lastly, I just have a quick little note saying that if you aren't a fan of the scallop border that I suggest to end the shawl, you can try tassels on the tips of your shawl. You could also just leave it plain. All right, so let's jump into section A, which is the beginning of our shawl. I'm going to move my pattern to the side and grab my yarn. So to start, I'm just using some scrap yarn for my project. Don't worry too much about the yarn or the hook that I'm using here. I'm just going to show the proper way to start your Flatiron shawl. So we're going to start with a slip knot and place that on our hook. And we're going to chain 5. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Next up, we're going to single crochet in the second chain from the hook, which is right here. Single crochet in that chain. We're going to single crochet in the following chain. And then we're going to increase in each of the last 2 chains. So 2 single crochet in the stitch. There's 1 and 2. 2. And then 2 single crochets in the last chain. There's 1 and 2. So that row ends with 6 single crochets. Now we're going to chain 1 and turn. And we're going to increase in the first stitch. So here's 1 and 2 single crochets in that stitch. And then we're going to single crochet across to the last 2 stitches and single crochet 2 together over those last 2 stitches. So these are the last 2 stitches. Here's 1 and 2. So we've got 3 single crochets to make in this row before we single crochet 2 together. So there's 1, 2, and 3. And now we're going to single crochet 2 together over these last 2 stitches. So we're going to pull up a loop on both those stitches. We've got 3 loops on our hook, yarn over, and pull through 3. And now we're going to chain 1 and turn. For row 3, we start by single crocheting across to the last 2 stitches, which are here. There's 1 and 2, and we're going to increase in each of those stitches. So single crochet across to those last 2 stitches, and here we are, and increase in each of those stitches. So there's 1 and 2, 1 and 2. Now we're going to chain 1 and turn, and for row 4 we're going to increase in this first stitch. So 2 single crochet here, there's 1 and 2, and then we're going to single crochet across to the last 2 stitches and single crochet 2 together. So here we are at our last 2 stitches, there's 1 and there's the other, single crochet 2 together. And that's it for rows 3 and 4, and you just repeat rows 3 and 4 for the pattern. We'll do those again together. We're going to chain 1 and turn, single crochet across to the last 2 stitches and increase in each of those. So here we go, single crochet in each stitch across to the last 2. And here we are at the last 2. Here's 1 and 2. And increase in each of those. So 2 single crochets in each of those stitches. And now we're going to chain 1 and turn and repeat row 4. So we're going to increase in this first stitch. There's 1 and 2. Single crochet across to the last 2 stitches and single crochet 2 together across those last 2 stitches. And here we are, we've got 1, 2 stitches left, single crochet 2 together over those last 2 stitches. So I'm going to do a few more rows on my swatch here just to show you what the shape looks like. Keep going with yours and meet me back here in just a moment. So here I have just a bit of a swatch that I continued on. So what I've just completed across this top row is a row 4 repeat. This is my single crochet 2 together here at the end. So if you take a look at this, and you will need to block this because it's going to curl, but if you take a look at it and kind of hold it out flat, you can see it's making kind of a boomerang shape. And it's a fairly symmetrical boomerang. So what I mean by that is if you fold it in half, the 2 halves are nearly identical. Neither one of the halves are significantly a different shape than the other. So as you're going along, if you have any concerns about whether or not you're doing the shape right, just understand that your project should be nearly identical, mirroring the 2 sides if you fold it in half. When you finish your project, you will want to block it just to make sure the drape looks good. You can do that by wet blocking or steam blocking, whatever is easiest for you, and you can find tutorials for that on YouTube. Thank you so much again for picking up the Flatiron Shawl pattern and for taking a look at this video. If you need any help, please email me at tlyarncrafts@gmail.com. And of course, share your progress and your finished project with me on Instagram with the hashtag TLYC Makers and the hashtag Flatiron Shawl. And you can also drop by the TLYC Makers Facebook group. Thanks again and have a good one.